I started reading philosophy because I was looking for answers. Answers to questions of meaning, purpose, and direction. And so, like many new readers of philosophy, I started with the existentialists. I found that I gravitated towards philosophers whose writing had a sort of literary quality to it. Kierkegaard, Camus, and Nietzsche were among the first philosophers whose work I fell in love with. Their books were exciting, they often blurred the line between fiction and philosophy, and although the language they used was often obscure, the ideas that they conveyed felt very relevant. Perhaps that's because one of the defining characteristics of existentialism is that existentialists are interested in meaning, authenticity, freedom, all kinds of things that I felt were lacking in my own life at that time. In a short period, I came to view existentialism and philosophy as almost being synonymous, and I wanted to learn more about this school of thought. At some point, I was directed to look into the work of Jean-Paul Sartre, widely viewed as one of the foremost thinkers in the existentialist movement of the 20th century. Billed as the principal text of modern existentialism, his book Being in Nothingness seemed like a logical place to begin. And so this bulky book accompanied me to school pretty much every day for about a week before I gave up. And I put Being in Nothingness back on my shelf where it remained for a while. You see, at the time, I was looking to philosophy for answers, but I wasn't necessarily as interested in understanding why or how a philosopher arrived at a given answer to some problem or question. And perhaps that's why Sartre didn't leave as much of an impression on me during my first encounter with existentialism. I liked Nietzsche, I liked Camus, I liked Kierkegaard. Reading their work I thought was exciting. Reading Sartre, on the other hand, felt more like a chore. I put Being in Nothingness away, and it wasn't until much later, after I had a more structured education in philosophy and had some more substantial life experiences, that I started to appreciate Sartre more, and I returned to his work with a fresh set of eyes. And when I did that, what I came away with was this. I began to suspect that the reason Sartre had proven more difficult for me to really appreciate, besides of course his dense and dizzying writing style, was the fact that it's not very clear where to begin. Sartre is famous for introducing many important terms and concepts into existentialist thought. But which of these concepts should someone start with if they're just starting to read Jean-Paul Sartre, or perhaps just starting to read existentialist philosophy at all? It was over 10 years ago that I first picked up Being in Nothingness and first started reading philosophy. And in that time, the way I look at philosophy has changed quite a lot. One of the ways that I look at philosophy today that's different from what I looked at it when I was a teenager, first starting to read it, is that today I look at philosophy as kind of like building a house. You start with the foundation when you build a house. You don't, for example, start with the roof. And Sartre's famous concepts like bad faith and nausea, or his enigmatic one-liners like man is condemned to be free, to me, those are like the roof of the house. That's what we see on the surface. But there's got to be some, what I like to call starting point to Sartre's philosophy, upon which all these other ideas and concepts are built. Looking for such a starting point or foundation, I've found is very helpful in us understanding and appreciating any philosopher's work. There may be no one right answer to the question of where to begin with Sartre, which concept is the most fundamental, but in my experience, what I found to be the starting point of Sartre's philosophy is something he expresses in his essay, Existentialism is Humanism, where he says that existence comes before essence. And that's what I want to talk about today. So Jean-Paul Sartre says that existence comes before essence. This is sometimes written as existence precedes essence. They mean the same thing. To precede means to come before. Some have called this the slogan of existentialism, and as a matter of fact, this phrase originated at a point when Sartre himself was trying to define existentialism. In his lecture, Existentialism is a Humanism, Sartre insists that this idea, existence comes before essence, is one thing that all existentialists can agree upon. It helps to understand why Sartre felt the need in the first place to look for some unifying idea upon which all existentialists could agree. As is the case with most philosophical movements, if not all, existentialism didn't begin with some clear, singular, unifying creed right from the get-go. But existentialism in particular is very tricky to define, and Sartre is aware of this. And the reason for this is that the roots of existentialism can actually be traced back to a philosopher who never used the term himself. And that philosopher was the Danish theologian Søren Kierkegaard. Although Kierkegaard predates modern existentialism by about 100 years or so, he's generally considered to be the father of this philosophical school. The reason for this is that Kierkegaard introduced a lot of the terms, concepts, and themes that later existentialists incorporated into their own work, including the idea of the absurd. Kierkegaard also talked a lot about the paradoxical relationship between people and freedom. Kierkegaard talked about the anxiety that arises from realizing that we are free and therefore responsible for how our lives turn out. Kierkegaard also placed a lot of emphasis on the individual, another central trait of existentialist thought. However, it wasn't until later philosophers like Jaspers, Husserl, and Heidegger who rediscovered Kierkegaard's writings and disseminated his ideas by incorporating them into their own work. You see, Kierkegaard's writings weren't that popular when he was alive, so it wasn't until later thinkers discovered his ideas and found them appealing, started to talk about him, and generated a lot of interest in his thoughts. And that's why there's this gap, because Kierkegaard wasn't popular when he was alive. It took about a century for European philosophy to really latch on to him, as well as Nietzsche. Nietzsche was also another philosopher who was not that popular when he was alive. But that's the reason there's this gap between the proto-existentialism of the 19th century and modern existentialism of the 20th century. But there was another kind of gap between these two phases of existentialism, one that was potentially more concerning than simply a gap in time. You see, Kierkegaard was not just a philosopher. He was fundamentally a Christian philosopher. By contrast, Sartre, Camus, Heidegger, and other modern existentialists were fundamentally atheistic philosophers, and they approached existentialism from that perspective. Most people would probably agree that belief or disbelief in a God, in a philosophical movement that is expressly concerned with matters of meaning and living authentically, that this is going to be a serious point of contention. What could possibly link these two phases of existentialist thought, the Christian existentialists and the atheist existentialists? What could unite them? Well, Sartre wondered the same thing, and what he came up with was this: whether you believe in God or whether you're an atheist, if you're an existentialist, then you agree on at least one thing, and that is that existence comes before essence. This answers the question of why Sartre felt the need to locate some unifying point on which Christian and atheist existentialists could agree. It's also one of the reasons that I think this idea is a good place to begin with reading and understanding Sartre. If it's true that this idea is something that serves as the bedrock of existentialism, as Sartre seems to think it does, then perhaps it's a good place to begin with understanding the philosopher who coined it, Sartre himself. So we've got our starting point, and it's something that Sartre himself probably would be comfortable with. But what exactly does it mean? If existence comes before essence, we may want to start by defining existence. This is not necessarily as easy as it might appear, But it is important to understand how existentialists view existence, since this is in fact one of the major features of existentialism that distinguishes it from previous schools of thought. Modern existentialism, you could say, really started to take shape when philosophers began articulating the following idea, that basically to merely speak of something existing is to speak in a way that doesn't make much sense. You could call this a existentialist grammar lesson. For an existentialist, to say merely that something exists or that someone exists is really to utter an incomplete sentence, a subject without a predicate. Because for an existentialist, it's not just that you or I exist, it's that you or I exist in the world. And this last part, this in the world, is what sets existentialism apart from certain previous philosophers who we'll talk about shortly. To exist in the world as opposed to what? Well, to exist in the world means, for example, we don't live as brains in a jar. You and I don't inhabit our own private little worlds. We inhabit this world with other objects that we can interact with and be interacted by, and we live in this world with one another as well as other people who we have an impact on and who have an impact on us, and so on. We live in an extended world that goes beyond just our minds. This concept of being or existing in the world, as it was articulated by Heidegger, was immensely influential on Sartre and the rest of modern existentialism. Heidegger's articulation of this being in the world was itself a major departure from another very influential philosopher named René Descartes. Descartes was a 16th century philosopher who also cared a lot about existence. Descartes' first meditations began with the following problem. We could express it this way. Basically, Descartes is saying, I want to know things. I want to know things for sure. But a lot of the sources of knowledge that I rely on are not actually that reliable at all. Specifically, Descartes mentions our senses: touch, taste, sight, smell. These, Descartes says, are very often wrong. One of the famous reasons he gives is think about when you're dreaming. You know, like I could be dreaming that I'm filming this video right now, and then I wake up and realize, oh, it was all a dream. But when we're dreaming, we think we're awake. And so Descartes is basically like, how do I know I'm not dreaming right now? Well, Descartes basically peels back everything until he comes up with what he thinks is the only thing he can be sure of. And that is known as the cogito. Cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. It actually goes first, I doubt, therefore I think, therefore I am. If you're not, quick refresher. Descartes says, I doubt that I exist. But if I'm doubting, that's a thought. And if there's a thought, there must be a thinker. That thinker must be me, because I'm the one thinking the thought. So if I'm thinking, then that means I exist. Awesome. The only problem for the existentialists is that Descartes strips away everything about the outside world and says the only thing he can know for sure to say with any certainty that he exists is in his own mind. And that lends itself to a kind of solipsism, basically this idea that you live in your own little private universe, that you don't really interact with anything outside of your own mind. But the existentialists understand existence as being in the world, which is to say, not just existing in your own mind. But it's more than that. It's much more than that. In fact, the reason I haven't said, first of all, the existentialists say we exist, and second of all, the existentialists say we exist in the world, is because that would be completely inappropriate. In fact, the existentialists view existence and existence in the world as being one and the same. It's a tautology. The two things are identical. To exist is to exist in a world. And so the idea that Descartes comes up with, the I think, therefore I am, and the reasoning that he uses to arrive at that conclusion is anathema to the philosophy that the existentialists want to develop. The existentialists also departed from some previous major lines of thought in philosophy with respect to the idea of essence. Basically, in philosophy, the essence or nature of a thing is what makes that thing what it is. This idea goes back pretty far, all the way back to Plato and Aristotle and so on. Plato was talking about essences and natures whenever he talks about his forms or ideas. Aristotle took this idea of an essence or nature of a thing one step further by adding in the element of teleology. Teleology basically has to do with purpose, or the reason for why something exists, what it's supposed to do. So for Aristotle, if teleology is bound up with the essence or nature of a thing, then what that basically means is that the essence or nature of something just is what it's supposed to do. So the essence or nature of an acorn, for example, might be to grow up and become an acorn tree. And this is kind of a thematic reoccurrence in Aristotle's philosophy, the idea that something should become whatever brought it into being in the first place. That's, what an acorn tree does is it makes acorns, and then those acorns become other acorn trees. Same thing with humans. The way that Aristotle understands the nature of the human and the purpose of human life is to become more like our creator, i.e. God, which we do by developing certain qualities that Aristotle ascribed to God. Chiefly among these, of course, was contemplation, which really shouldn't surprise us. After all, Aristotle's a philosopher, so of course he's going to think that God loves philosophy just as much as he does, right? Makes sense. So the important thing to keep in mind here for someone like Aristotle is that essence comes before existence. What we are, or what we're supposed to be, is already in place. There's a job waiting for us to do before we arrive, right? Before we come into being, what we're supposed to be doing just already is. We kind of arrive after the fact. There is this purpose for human life, and then a particular human is born, and they either fulfill that purpose or they fail to fulfill that purpose. That would be the Aristotelian approach to the purpose and nature of human existence. Now, the existentialists reversed this, of course. They said it's not that essence comes before existence, it's the other way around. But it's not because Sartre and most of the other modern existentialists were atheists, whereas Aristotle believed in some kind of God, a concept which was closely bound up with Aristotle's idea of the purpose and nature of human existence. That's not really the central reason, although it's tempting to think so. But consider the fact that Søren Kierkegaard, also an existentialist, was a Christian. He wasn't an atheist. And yet Kierkegaard's work seems to very clearly demonstrate a rejection of this idea that first there's this purpose, this job for you to do, and then you come into the picture and either fulfill it or fail to fulfill it. And that idea lends itself to, I suppose, a very clear path being presented. But if you're familiar at all with Kierkegaard's writing, the characters that populate his works are never presented with a clear path to follow, and it creates anxiety for them. Think of Abraham bringing Isaac to Mount Moriah in Fear and Trembling. Probably one of the best examples of a character in Kierkegaard's work whose path is not certain. At no point is Abraham ever for sure certain that he's doing the right thing. He has to rely on faith. If Kierkegaard really thought that essence came before existence, these kinds of problems wouldn't arise. There wouldn't be a guy who has to decide whether to sacrifice his own son for God. There wouldn't be like the young man in Repetition who's deciding, what should I do about this relationship? I don't know what to do. The whole of either or would not have come into being. because the path would be clear enough. Another thing to keep in mind, returning to Sartre, is that Sartre and the other existentialists, unlike Aristotle, don't start with the idea of something having a nature, primarily because the existentialists are interested not in what should be or what's supposed to be. They're much more interested in what is. That's where they begin their philosophical inquiry, with what is, what exists. With all this in mind then, what can we say about this so-called slogan of existentialism, this supposed unifying idea that all existentialists agree on? Sartre's existence comes before essence. What does it mean? It means that you exist, and what you are, how you are, what you become, that follows afterwards. Existentialism is all too often confused with nihilism. I think this happens because sometimes existentialism is introduced as beginning with the premise that life has no meaning. In one sense, this is true. Existentialists say there is no inherent or innate meaning presented to us by life. They say that is absurd to expect so. But existentialists also pay a lot of attention to the importance of creating meaning. At least that's one crude way of expressing it. Finding meaning or choosing meaning, these are other ways of expressing it, which is not the same thing as nihilism. Nihilism does not point you in the direction of meaning at all. But even if we begin with the premise that existentialism is the philosophy of life having no inherent meaning, so life is what you make of it, is not only overly simplistic, but I think it neglects the fact that this very idea that life has no inherent meaning can't be the starting point for existentialism. Because in fact, this idea actually follows from Sartre's existence precedes essence. Because there is no essential nature to you as an individual person, no program in your head that forces you to act a certain way, no path you are destined to inescapably follow, you are both free and responsible. And on the flip side, it means that there's no meaning being given to you. Rather, the meaning of your life only becomes apparent through and by the actions that you choose. We want life to make sense, but in fact it is us who are supposed to be making sense of life. Since our essence, who and what we are, only becomes apparent through our actions as we enact them, through our lives as we live them, to suppose that life has some kind of pre-packaged meaning for us is, for an existentialist, a way of passing the buck, so to speak. And this can take a number of forms, whereby we identify with something else as me, something other than the fundamental fact of my existence. Could be my job, my nationality, my favorite sports team. All of these are examples of what Sartre calls bad faith, where we misconstrue our essence with the fact of our existence. At least that's one part of bad faith. Another concept that I talked about earlier in this video, which follows from existence preceding essence. Of course, another example of bad faith is trying to trick yourself into believing something when really that's not what you believe at all. Tricking yourself into thinking that you're doing something for one reason when really it's something else. This is very related to the other variant of bad faith. But I think it's particularly apropos because the honest truth is this video was not the first one I wanted to do on Sartre. I actually wanted to do a video on Sartre's view of belief. But I found that, first of all, this is not a topic that's talked about very much in connection to Sartre, and the way I'm planning to go about it might be a little unconventional. But I also found that it was very hard to talk about belief without first talking about bad faith. And then the video becomes too long, and then I end up not talking about belief at all. So I thought, well, All right, we'll start out with bad faith. But that presented its own problem, because bad faith rests so heavily on this idea of existence preceding essence, it made it very difficult to jump right into a video on a concept that relies so heavily on this more fundamental idea. And that's what really made me want to dig deeper into this idea and the history of it and how it kind of shaped modern existentialist thought. And it would be bad faith for me to suggest that this was the plan from the beginning. As Soren Kierkegaard, the father of existentialism, said, life is lived forwards and only understood backwards. Perhaps that's a good slogan for all of philosophy. If you're new to Sartre or have some experience with him and think that maybe there's another concept of his that would be a better starting point for someone who's just getting into his work, definitely leave a comment below. Always open to other interpretations of these philosophers' work and other ideas. Hope that you got something out of this and enjoy reading Sartre. Thanks.